important to understand that the connections with Israel is also what's called, it's one of the D9 or maybe now D10 digital nations. So these digital nations are advancing sort of open data government, open source, coding everything, and it's framed as, transparent and, accountable and accessible, but it's also very much about turning the public sphere into something that can be commodified as a data stream, and that corporate interests can take this open data and manufacture apps and different things to go along with it to create essentially economic outlets and profit for themselves. But it's all based on mining personally identifiable data of the citizens, like including down to babies, right, and old people. Like all of it we are all just become fuel for the data mining engine in these open government, smart government programs. So there might be a new one. You want to check and see? A new? Check my Facebook and then read. Okay, just a second. Because it might have created a fresh new one. Yeah, it did. Oh, one sec. So just a second, guys. Oh, lost my thing. Share. Should be the top of you'll see your. Okay.
Folks, I'm just having I created another Facebook stream and it seems to be streaming. So I'm just having her share it on her page.
Here, let me get my pen. Okay. So yes. So Rhode Island, COVID, Israel, reopening, and blockchain identity are all together and connected on this webinar. So I think it's important to talk about this because essentially within this sort of predatory space of social impact investing and biosecurity, I think it's really important for people to understand that actually the vanguard of a lot of these programs are Democratic governors. So this is coming through sort of neoliberal Democrats, of which Governor Gina Raimondo is one of them. It's very interesting because in the state of Rhode Island, Gina Raimondo, she was elected in 2015. Before that, she was the state treasurer. And many of these impact programs are actually framed as like state treasury programs. So in the future, like digital benefit systems, digital vouchers, those will be framed as state treasury department elements. So that's interesting that she came from the treasury. Now she's governor. The other piece of this, her husband, his name is Andy Moffett. So Andy Moffett had a background at McKinsey and Associates. And he was in their education division, their global education division, and had close ties to, I believe it's Michael Barber, who was an advisor to Tony Blair. And together they collaborated on something called deliverology, which is essentially impact metrics around social programs and government services. So all of it is set up around impact investing. So you have Gina Raimondo, who was in the treasury before that. She was actually a venture capitalist, and she worked for a company called Point Judith Capital. So Point Judith Capital actually worked a lot in the ICT, individual communication technology space, as well as telehealth. So they were already working in that space well in advance of her, moving into her government positions and beginning to court Israeli tech for Rhode Island. And so she had that background in venture capital. Also specifically, they were partnered with Tudor Investments, and Tudor Investments is Paul Tudor Jones's hedge fund, and he is connected to the Robin Hood Foundation and the human capital markets that came out of the Harlem Children's Zone. So Paul Tudor Jones and Tudor Investments are key players in the human capital analytics area, and Point Judith Capital has very close ties to that. So that is her background. She's coming out of tech venture capital with associates in human capital investing. Her husband is a high-level consultant of deliverology with global ties in global education developments. His background was with Teach for America before McKinsey. So that's what they do, Teach for America, and then they bump people over into these global consultancies to enact these larger policies. So just going back to the webinar, again, it was August 24th. The opening individual, her name was Liz Tanner. And she, like I said, she was the head of business regulation So she, again, was espousing Estonia as the model, saying that they were going to start with credentialing and move on, but they had an RFP for many, many uses of blockchain. I'm sorry, this is a bit scattered, but Gina Raimondo, the other piece of context to know is that last November, she brought a whole bunch of folks from Rhode Island to Israel to do cultivating visits of various tech companies there. And again, these companies, many of which are companies with like large footprints in the United States. So we're talking IBM, we're talking Dell, we're talking Salesforce. These are not strictly Israeli companies. These are global tech companies, many of whom have headquarters in the US. So she already had this underway in November of working with the tech sector in Israel and trying to sort of cultivate them to bring them into Rhode Island for their tech accelerator biohubs that they had set up. The other piece that's important to know about Rhode Island is, for such a small state, it has a ton of defense contractors. So I just looked it up before we started. I think in that small state alone, there are 143 defense contractors. And like the high-level command for the US Navy is out of Newport. So you have a lot of military interests, and like I said, in these relationships between tech and surveillance and data and potentially like ties with Israel, that it also overlaps with US defense interests and intelligence interests as well. It's very fluid. And all of this is going on in Rhode Island with this Democratic governor who is sort of peak neoliberalism with her husband who has his hands in education. As I mentioned before, there were going to be three nodes for social impact investing, which, as I see it, is education, which we have, healthcare, which we have. The other is housing. And I wanted to say that Rhode Island was part of a pilot program for HUD in 2017 with insights from the Harvard Government Performance Lab, which used to be their social impact bond lab, around housing, specifically supportive housing for returning citizens. So I don't have as much on the housing piece, but Rhode Island has sort of three components of data-driven social service analytics all going on at the same time. The other piece is that Brown University, which is based in Rhode Island, is one of 6 sort of data analytics hubs. They have an innovation policy center based at Brown, and they are a hub of sort of innovative policy, social welfare policy, but a lot of it is tied to interoperable data systems. So again, that is embedded at Brown. And there's some interesting history, like if you look into Brown around slavery, also Rhode Island, that there are many issues with slavery tied in with university systems historically, and sort of making sort of addressing that through the university system. So sort of the racial capitalism piece is sort of threaded throughout. Okay, so let me just look. Does anybody have questions on what I've said so far? I don't know if you want to leave a comment on Jason's page. Feel free.
If I get a question, I will.
You will shoot it over.
I will relay it.
Okay, so diagnostic robotics. Let me just pull that up. They are working with the Israeli Health Department and with Rhode Island on COVID. They had developed something for Rhode Island called a self-checker app. So this is like you have an app and you're triaging your symptoms to see like how you should be dealt with in terms of your potential of having COVID. That company is affiliated with something called the 8200 unit, which is the signals intelligence division of the Israeli Defense Forces. So many of the Israeli tech interests actually have really clear ties to Israeli security state, cybersecurity, signals intelligence. So young people come in, they get trained in these divisions in their time of service, and then they come back out and then they spin off that knowledge into tech companies, many of which are now health tech companies and MTech health companies, which is, as you remember, it's UN Sustainable Development Goal number 3, is the tech, the data tied to health tech. So the 8200 unit actually has, its alumni have created its own social impact accelerator called 8200 Impact. So it's very much, it's not just tech for tech's sake, it's tech for data analytics for impact investing specifically. And this is, I've always said that I believe that Gaza is the model for sort of the open air prison. But the other piece is that evidently there's a lot of income inequality in Israel itself among non-Palestinians. And so they're framing a lot of these technologies. They're actually data mining Israelis and talking about engineering social impact gaps within the state of Israel as well, with its own citizens. The woman who is the chair and the chief technology officer for diagnostic robotics, her name is Kira Radinsky, and I just want to talk a little bit about her based on her LinkedIn profile, because again, this is one of the things I do often is, I just say, who are these people? Like, how do they represent themselves to the world? And that's what LinkedIn is really good for. And so her background, essentially, so she came out of Technion, which is the Israel Institute of Technology. It's sort of like the MIT of Israel. And Technion actually has a presence in the United States sorry, am I?
No, just keep going, but just I'll
Oh, you wave?
There was a question.
Okay, all right. In New York City, Cornell Tech on Roosevelt Island, the small data lab, the health data analytics lab is in New York City. So that the tech part is Technion. So she came out of Technion. Her specialty, she was sort of like a wunderkind around algorithms and predictive analytics. So that was her specialty. And she honed those skills in the Israeli Defense Forces. And then later she came out and she worked for the Israel Securities Authority, so the finance industry. She worked for, she was a researcher for about 4 years for Microsoft, and then later went on to be a chief data scientist for eBay. And again, we're talking about auctions and pricing. She worked for a company called Sales Predict, which was a price forecasting software. And she was an advisor for HSBC Holdings. And one of the things that's really compelling about HSBC is that I've seen it circulating online, is that there are posters in public areas of the UK which have HSBC posters with a thumbprint with like a QR code on it. And it's like your DNA will be your identity in the future. And so all of these things coming together, thinking about predictive military signals intelligence, price forecasting, financial instruments forecasting, auctions, and health data comes together in COVID. And so I think that's the kind of overview that we need to understand. The context of what COVID is about putting people onto digital platforms that they can never escape from in order to extract data to create and drive financial markets and predictive profiling markets, and data that can also not only capture people within global financial markets, but then manage them in such a way that they can forestall any sort of revolutionary activity if people feel like they don't think that's a good plan anymore. That if you have these predictive analytic systems, that you can intervene in various ways to preempt any changes to the status quo system. So when we're talking about Rhode Island and their relationship with the Israeli Health Department and bringing in diagnostic robotics and essentially setting up the state of Rhode Island as a biotech hub, what does that mean for the citizens of Rhode Island? What does it mean for their future and the future of their children connected to that? So yeah, Jason, you had a question? I think there's a question.
If people can hear me. Someone asked about, is this Brown Brothers Harriman? And I think that might have been related to something you might have said earlier.
I need to look up. This is Brown University, so I know Brown Brothers Harriman generally. I don't know what the connection, if there's a connection. I think Brown Brothers Harriman actually has Philadelphia ties, but I'd need to look that up, and I don't have that at my fingertips. So.
And another question was from Ian. My main question at the moment, how paranoid should I be about getting diagnosed with autism, given fascism's history there, and how a STEM degree can be used without contributing to mass extinction?
Yeah, it's a hard one. I have to say, like when I gave a talk in Tulsa and in January, and people from the DSA were there, like doing a live stream, which was great. But later I talked about an app that was about court appearance, like it was like a court appearance app. and it was framed as like a progressive app that you would, if you needed a ride to court or you needed social welfare, like around your court appearance or something, like you could get it. But it was one of these impact things, and the people were like, we're so upset. Uptrust, it was called Uptrust, was the app. This is a corporate app, but it actually had been coded by these people and then stolen by a company and turned into a commercial product. But I'm like, you guys coded Uptrust? And they thought it was a good thing. They thought they were doing good. And part of it is like within a global economic system that runs on data, I don't know what it means for people who are really good at coding or who are really enjoy and appreciate it. I don't know, because clearly we've already built a huge economy on it. If we're going to say that this is not the direction we want to go in, then the people who have all those skills need to find something else that is also satisfying to them, like in their life, a way to contribute to society. And right now, I don't feel like there's a way of getting around building this panopticon, like the data that we're generating even tonight, like with this live stream, like I'm feeding the signals intelligence machine. Somebody out there is running an algorithm saying, getting my sentiment analysis about, IDF and signals intelligence, and that's feeding into some predictive analytics somewhere. So, I don't know how to escape it. I mean, I think part of it is just speaking the truth of it and contesting that. I think it's not the right thing to look aside and pretend it isn't happening. And maybe by surfacing it, I don't know all the tech things. Honestly, I'm not a tech person, and most of the stuff I've learned not by coding. I don't know the ins and outs of this. I know it from sort of a sociological standpoint of doing research analytics on LinkedIn's than actually doing the physical work. So, I mean, I would say in many respects, people on the spectrum are probably desirable for this system. I mean, I think they need people who have that focus and who have that skill set. So in terms of a diagnosis, my question is any diagnosis, not of autism or being on the spectrum, is that being engaged in a health system is going to mean in the future being put on a pathway of compliance, of behavioral compliance. And my feeling is that once you realize that the health data system is about creating global financial profit for a very few numbers of people, that once you're on these pathways, it's not actually for your benefit. And the chances of getting off the pathway is going to be increasingly difficult. So I would say that's not necessarily strictly about that one diagnosis, but it's about any diagnosis. So, I mean, part of it is maybe finding, are there other alternate providers? I mean, when I wrote my dystopic story, I tried to find the social worker who was the non-Internet of Things, holistic revolutionary social worker. What are the other ways that we can get care and support for our bodily and our mental well-being that are not that? So I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah, he says, holy cow, way better answer than I expected.
Oh, sorry. I mean, the reality is that we have built this world. So if we're going to untangle it, and my whole goal is that people should be able to do things that give them satisfaction. Ultimately, that's what we should be after, is that you can, as long as you're not hurting other people. That's the caveat. Don't hurt other people. That's the baseline. So, and maybe people who are knowledgeable of coding know some other way. Clearly I have come to know and respect people who know this very intimately, and they have much better ideas about the logistics of it than I do. And I keep trying to find the tesseract. That's the thing. If you guys can find that, that would be awesome. So I'm just sort of looking back through my notes. I talked about Andy Moffat. I think McKinsey and deliverology is really important to understand. I think Andy Moffat's ties to Michael Barber and Tony Blair. So this is what I did not know about Blair and the New Labour Party, is that he actually evidently back in 1997 was already pitching social impact as a concept. Now, the United Kingdom is another one of the 10 digital nations. So the digital nations I had mentioned before, Estonia, that's the one that's always sort of brought out. And again, it's a small nation, kind of the equivalency of Rhode Island, a little test bed that they can experiment with. So you have Estonia, you have the United Kingdom, you have Israel, you have Canada, you have New Zealand, Mexico, South Korea, Uruguay, which is interesting. I'm not, like, if there was an odd one out, I think Uruguay is really interesting, but like in the grand scheme of things, and I'm not sure, but I think that's the broad arc of the digital nations. And I think it's interesting to see how the COVID thing is playing out in these various places. Like, what does it look like in South Korea? What is it looking like in Canada? What does it look like New Zealand? Clearly, there's some crazy stuff going on. And in the UK, which is intensifying in its lockdowns. So the UK has long been a digital nation. And what digital is going to mean is going to be big data, disruption, the fourth industrial revolution, those sorts of things. And this was already being planned out in 1997 by Blair, who brought in this innovation unit, brought in advisors who were sort of disruptive, the deliverology types, pushing impact metrics and social impact metrics. Barber, who was his education advisor, went on to become the chair of Pearson, which is the big testing and online curriculum company, Affordable Learning, the Pearson Affordable Learning division, and that's going to be global online learning for badging and reskilling in human capital markets. So that's really useful. I would just say if folks are interested to poke around on Little Sis, if you look up Michael Barber and Andy Moffat, there's some interesting stuff going on there. And again, with Gina Raimondo and Point Judith Capital and Tudor Investments. The other thing I want to spend a little bit of time just revisiting the education piece. So we talked health data analytics tied to COVID, and the prediction systems and the pricing systems and the derivatives and the data analytics. On the education side, there's some specific things going on in Rhode Island that I wanted to mention. There's an organization there called the Highlander Institute, and they've taken a lot of Gates money, and they kind of trade on that, the Highlander, like the progressive, in Tennessee, right? Yeah.
Sure,
so,
I've been there with Sherry.
Right. So it sounds great. So they pick up this name. For a while it was a school for children and with special learning needs, and then it became a charter school that was really piloting ed tech. And they took a lot of Gates money at that time. And then eventually it became an institute that was mostly used to train educators. And so what they needed to do was to train the teachers to become the agents of this new impact investing program and through the technology. And so, and I feel bad for the teachers because for a lot, they're underpaid, they're underappreciated, they have a really tough job. And so someone comes and brings them to a fancy institute for a retreat and treats them really nice and says, you can change the world here. We're going to teach you this, and you turn around and teach all of your fellow teachers at your schools and, be the change agents, and it's all going to be wonderful. And so that's what the Highlander Institute has done in Rhode Island, and then also they have a division in Syracuse, New York. And these teachers don't really have a context to understand what the bigger picture is behind all of the educational technology. But what Highlander was pushing is something called blended learning, which is, I don't know, I guess at this point we're mostly seeing full-on online learning. But blended learning is the idea that you're in a physical school building, and while you have some points in time in the day that you have face-to-face instruction, at least a third or more of the day is you on a device, either individually or in small groups. And so this model of blended learning was picked up in Rhode Island, and they were pitching it actually as early as 2012, the state education department, RIDE. And this was done with Michael Horn, who was a colleague of Clayton Christensen. And Clayton Christensen was known as sort of like the head disruptor. He coined the term disruption. And what he initially, when I first started following him, he wanted to disrupt healthcare and education. Now I think the website is up to they want to disrupt everything. It's Clayton Christensen and also InnoSight, INNOSIGHT Institute. InnoSight was connected to this person, Michael Horn, and Michael Horn was pitching blended learning in Rhode Island in 2012, and then they picked it up more broadly in 2016, the blended learning model, and they were coming up with something called Eduvate and Ed Clusters and Gates was pouring a lot of money into digital promise of remaking Rhode Island's education system through technology. So that's the blended learning piece. The other big piece that's important to understand from the human capital market side of things is work-based learning. And so we're going to see a huge push for that now of reskilling, lifelong learning, skills-based learning. And the model that is pitched, it's branded in this very progressive language. It's called big picture learning. Big picture learning is a model that went back, I think, to the early 90s. They were, or maybe the early 2000s. They were one of the Gates-funded small high schools. And they were working with something called the Business Innovation Factory. And Saul Kaplan, who had ties to Eli Lilly, Accenture, and some other accounting firms. He was the sort of the founder, board chair behind the Business Innovation Factory and Big Picture. And it was very much about work-based learning, but they framed it as your passion. You can follow your passion. Like, you can be a DJ, you can be a drummer, you can, you only have to go to school like 2 or 3 days a week, and the other time you're apprentice and you're out in the community learning things. Which of course plays really well into the ed reform narrative of like you defund schools and maybe you just piggyback the kids in the school if half of them aren't even actually in the room half of the time and they're out in this work-based learning. But and so this started in Rhode Island and now it's franchised and it's in various countries. We have a couple in Philadelphia. Our school district gave them $26 million of our public money to this. It's technically a public school, but it's kind of like a management company that runs the school. And in Pennsylvania, you still can't totally jettison the kids outside of school. There's an obligation that you stay in school a certain amount of time. But in New York City and Rhode Island, the kids are out of school a lot of the time doing quote unquote work. But some of the kids don't ever get placements. And my feeling is moving forward that we're going to see a lot more like virtual reality studios where you do virtual apprenticeships in your VR headsets. And that's going to be your work-based component with competency-based education and these ex-API skills being captured. But Big Picture started in Rhode Island, again, framed as progressive, but always tied with business interests, tech interests, and a lot of healthcare because the backing of, I believe, Highlander and maybe Big Picture, CVS, the drugstore. So there's a lot of like drug healthcare training. The career tracks are going to be healthcare tracks because essentially the healthcare track is the biosecurity state moving forward. So I had a colleague a connection I had made someone who is a teacher, a high school teacher in London, and he serves a community that has a lot of immigrants. Low income community, a lot of immigrants, and he was seeing things, and so he made a connection. He was following, I think it was called Privatizing Schools is his blog, and so we did a back and forth interview about. He said nobody here understands that we're being taken over by American privatization education interests. They're not getting it. They don't see what's happening in the U.S. And can you have this back and forth with me so that people believe me that this is really happening? So I did that. With Matthew, and one of the things he talked about, he said, did you know that the first social impact bond in the UK for education is with Big Picture Learning? I said, oh, I did not know that. So again, we have the first social impact bond. It's with Doncaster, I believe, and it's going to be a work-based learning social impact bond tied to education. Again, this will be framed as for like at-risk or opportunity youth. And once you get these education bonds going, we know that they're already talking about blockchain bonds and running through the World Bank. Big Picture Learning is also in Australia, and Australia is also the pilot launch for the Bond I, which is the World Bank blockchain bond. So before COVID, like in the back of my mind, I was thinking, the first education like bond program is going to come in Australia. I'm like, it's going to be Big Picture Learning, it's going to be human capital bonds on the World Bank, and it's going to come in through Australia. And again, this is pre-COVID, but what we're going to realize is once they're able to set up these biometric digital identity systems, and they'll do that using COVID as the justification, then they're going to be able to start layering in all sorts of other elements, including education vouchers and including this work-based learning program. So I think Australia, if you guys are listening in, you should be paying attention to Big Picture Learning and social impact bonds in that respect. And Gina Raimondo is also one of the founding members of something called Skillful, which is, again, one of these future of work. You won't really have any permanent job. It will be micro work with skills and credentials. So Skillful is another piece of this puzzle in Rhode Island. And then just a couple years ago, actually, Rhode Island was called the personalized learning state. It was going to be the personalized learning state, and the centerpiece for that was going to be Summit Learning, or Summit Basecamp, which is blended learning software that came out of Mark Zuckerberg. So essentially it's Facebook education where children are consuming online modules. And as we know, looking at how Facebook data mines and the sentiment analysis and how they predictively profile and can use feedback loops to shape both your mental state and what you see and what information you can access, that is essentially what Summit Basecamp is grounded in. And Rhode Island was going to be the major test bed for Summit Basecamp. So that's that piece. And then the other piece about Rhode Island is that there's some interesting connections to Tulsa. Tulsa also has its own ties to Israel. There are two philanthropies that are operating in Tulsa, the George Kaiser Foundation and the Schusterman Foundation, that both have very close ties to Israel. The Deborah Gist, who was the state superintendent of instruction, she left Rhode Island and then became superintendent of the Tulsa Public Schools, and has been closing schools, closing programs, cutting back on the Native Studies programs, the deaf programs. I was there in January. There's all sorts of disruption going on in the Tulsa Public Schools. And I'm just trying to think. So that was Gist. And then I thought that there was another Tulsa connection. Michael Horn was working with Richard Culotta, who was also with EdTech under Arnie Duncan. So a lot of this is coming in under Democrats, folks, and I just want to make it very clear about the privatization and the data surveillance and tracking. So again, I'm going to jump back. I know this is a bit all over the place, but to the webinar. This is about the Reopen program. This is beyond the robotics diagnostics. They didn't actually even talk about that in the webinar itself. They had different individuals. And let me just pull up. Sorry. Jason, do you have any thoughts here while I pull this up?
Well, we have
a question?
Yeah, Jane on Facebook asked how this will affect art. How does this impact performing arts schools? If you had thoughts on that piece of it. Hold on, let me get this.
Is it time for me to say something?
I'll just chime in while she's looking that up. If you're just joining us, we have a live stream on Argus Fest YouTube channel, and we also have it on Facebook. So wherever you're watching us, if you could share it with us. Like I said, this was not planned, so we didn't really schedule this. It was a total last minute deal. And if you're not familiar with Allison, and you might be like, what the heck is she talking about? Stick with this, because it's actually really important stuff. And I basically have dedicated my summer, or a good chunk of my summer, into promoting the work that Allison is doing, and my time is valuable.
It is, Jason. We appreciate it. We're very
but that's how much I believe in the work that she's done over the past 5 years, and it's all coming to fruition. A lot of the stuff that she was saying many years ago, and people thought she was nuts, is actually coming to reality. So I'll jump back to Allison.
All right. So I guess the question was, how does this affect performing arts schools? And so my feeling, based on what I've seen over the past year with investments that Bloomberg Philanthropy is making in the arts, is that the arts are very powerful, and they are going to want to be subsumed within this larger agenda. So I don't think the goal will be to erase the arts per se, but I think they will be intended to harness the arts to advance social impact goals. And I would say this isn't performing arts per se, visual arts. There's been a lot of visual artists elements that have been incorporated into like the COVID branding and murals and visual things that you're seeing in public spaces. I saw some in Indianapolis of bringing artists in and saying, you know, this is what we will, you know, give you grants to create art about. The performing arts piece is interesting. You know, I'm really wondering, they don't want people together. And I think one of the things that really struck me in the first couple of weeks of the COVID, my child did choral singing at school and loved it. I mean, was never like a solo singer types of person, but loved the social element of learning music together and singing together and performing. And that was very powerful. In fact, like a lot of their peer group was this group of people who came together to create music together, just vocal music. And when I heard with COVID, they're like, nobody can sing, right? You can't sing. Nobody can go to church. Look at those terrible people who went to church and they sang and look, you know, people died. It was dangerous. Singing is a weapon. You could kill someone with that song. Like that's the thing. And I don't know, Jason, if you remember that, but like that was coming out the first 2 weeks. And I have someone that I work with for whom that is singing is a big piece of their identity as well. And they're like, yeah, you know, we just got news from the global choral people that like we're just not doing it anymore, like indefinitely. And coming at this is, you guys, some of you listen, like have seen me talk before, but I do think that there's an element of energetic systems and vibration and like things beyond the quantification that performance, whether that be singing or creating music or performing theatrically or in spoken word poetry, that there's an energy that's put out into the world when that happens, either individually or in groups, but particularly in groups, that for them to shut all of that down was very significant and I think intentional. I think it was very intentional. I worry that it's all going to start to go into virtual reality. And I've heard of places where they're already seeding very specific tester grants to normalize the use of digital media and virtual reality arts as the new art space, right? And so I can imagine, like just as we've seen with the growth of esporting events and the normalization of that and gaming events over you know, in-person activities, I can see that performance will start to move in that direction. And I know right now that there's issues with syncing. I guess that's why they couldn't do choral singing online because of the time difference or whatever. Like people couldn't sing together. But, you know, I would say give it a few years and they're going to have it figured out. And they're going to say, you know, you have to sit, you know, at home alone, but you can sing with, you know, they'll probably have like a global choir of everyone singing on Zoom or something, and they'll reshape it that way. So I think we can fight it though. Like I think we should fight it all the way down. But I think we should know their headspace, and their headspace is performing arts is a threat to unless it is harnessed within the impact system. And I think what they will do is they will harness art to impact, and they will say, how did this art advance our agenda? How did it advance better health? How did it advance better mental health? How did it advance, you know, food system? They'll come up with some way to tie it in. And I have a feeling like there's an organization in Philadelphia called the Mural Arts, that they're connected with the impact investors, and they do a lot of art tied to people who are incarcerated and people who are in targeted communities. And so the art will be conditional if it's coming from philanthropies. And so how do we carve out spaces to, like, is this underground art? Like, is it like really underground art? Is that what it looks like? Because I think that might be what has to be, there. We may have to make provisions for that. So, but it's vital that we protect that. I think it's vital that we protect it.
So I forgot to write down who asked this. I'm jumping back and forth between the two streams, but someone asked, could they trap us into giving our data willingly by tying it to a UBI, saying it's a digital human rights program? We'll pay you for giving us your data, like a paid shopper program. So that was one of the questions.
Yeah. Okay. So that kind of segues a little bit into the other piece that I was going to talk about, the Commons Project, so maybe I can sort of bring the two together. So I think you're definitely right. I believe that will be the case. I think the devil's bargain will be they'll say, oh, well, right now, look at all these people are making all this money off your data and you have no benefit off of it. So if you own and control your data, that'll be so much better for you. And maybe if you can unlock your data for value and sell it. And I know that people are already selling health data records as it is, not on blockchain. It's like, I think the data will be like the new plasma bank. So I had thought, like, there's a number of options I thought the digital identity might come in on. Like, I had thought maybe it would be an education voucher. I thought maybe it could be a universal basic income. I think now it seems more clear that it's going to be the biometric health passport. And once you have that biometric identity established, you can layer in any kind of digital record on top of that. And that's what the state of Illinois has been working on with their blockchain task force. They had a report in 2018 was they were looking at, again, your credentials, your public benefit access, your voting, your work history, your health status. All of these things would be layered into one interoperable data system. But the problem with that is that essentially it means that you become a commodity. Like, you are the sum total of what's in your digital identity account, right? And only the people who have the billionaire class, the Davos class, will never have to tap into that account. They'll never have to show anyone their data because they'll be able to survive outside of it. Most everybody else is going to have to open up their data because they need healthcare, because they need education, because they need to eat, because they need housing. And what that means is that essentially you're living in a global surveillance state, because unlocking your data means they're just going to collect more data. Right, so they need to know what food you eat, where you go, what time you come home. They need to have a retinal scan on your door.
Hang on, we're getting some audio problems.
Sorry.
That's okay.
Those are my hair.
Let me just check here.
Oh.
Where's the thing?
Sorry.
No, you don't. Come on, you have to figure out what's going on.
Is it fuzzy or just not here?
I think it's just the sound level went down.
They're on to it, Jason.
They're figuring something out. Go ahead and talk again.
Okay. So I was talking about UBI.
Nope, hold on. Still not there. Why is this not doing? Hang on. So just let me jump to me. Somehow this got switched. Okay, so just so you know, I'm just working on solving this this problem here. So sorry about that, you guys. Thanks for alerting us. Give me a second. Go ahead and talk.
Okay. So we're talking about the UBI, the health data. The state of Illinois is looking at doing birth certificates on blockchain. That was a couple years ago. But I think it's going to be the biometric health passports is how they're gonna get everybody. And it will probably be tied into a UBI element. Like, they'll say, once you have essentially it's not unlike what happened with the payments through the federal government payments here in the US, that if you were already synced up with your if you had filed electronically your taxes, everything was hooked up and you got if you were eligible, you got your payment pretty quickly. But if you were old school and you didn't have an e-filing system, it took much longer, right? So that's what I think what will happen is they'll say, oh, well, if you want your benefit, if you want to access this, you have to have your digital identity set up. And so UBI will be a gatekeeper. I don't know. It's possible that it will come first, like before the health passports, but I'm not sure. I think right now they're trying a lot of different options to see what sticks and what's going to work to scale, because that's the trick. They have a lot of different pilots, but they don't have anything that can scale rapidly. Estonia is the model for the digital identity system on blockchain, and but they're a small country. And so my gut is that like Rhode Island is going to be the one coming up for the pilot. pilot state because they're already so advanced on ed tech data analytics. They have the infrastructure at Brown with the Innovative Policy Lab. They have an agreeable government. They have the tech, an economy that's sort of grounded in military and tech interests. And clearly they're already going down this road with the health reopening with the Israeli tech connection. So I want to talk a little bit. Are we working now? Does it sound good?
I think we're good, yeah.
Okay. Along those lines, the health passports lines, I wanted to talk about something called the Commons Project. And the Commons Project, someone alerted me because they sent me, and people send me things all the time, which I appreciate. Sometimes it's a bit like a tsunami, like keeping up. But it was a webinar that was from July called The Role of Digital Identity in Healthcare Transformation. Okay, so this was, again, about digital identity and healthcare transformation, which means you're going to be mined for your data. But who was giving this seminar? Well, the company was called Onfido, O-N-F-I-D-O, and that company what they sell is artificial intelligence and facial recognition identity verification services. Okay, so if that makes you feel good, right? And then the other one was MasterCard. So it's the facial recognition digital identity and MasterCard are teaming up with the Commons Project to talk about healthcare transformation. Well, it turns out the Commons Project, it was started like the middle of last year, as far as I can tell. It was created with Rockefeller money. Again, Rockefeller, just to give people a refresher in case they forget, Rockefeller, was at the founding of the United Nations. They're early on in the vaccine programs. They're key elements in data analytics and social impact finance and smart cities and Identity 2020 and social impact bonds and Internet of Things data analytics and COVID tracking tied to workforce and tied to training modules for contact tracing and all of these things. So Rockefeller is tied in with all of that. They're backing the Commons Project. And the Commons Project, so it started middle of last year, as far as I can tell. I looked up their Twitter feed, I think it was last August. They had a couple retweets, like 2, and then silence until this April where they started tweeting occasionally about COVID. In July, they launched their global board. So I don't know what their board was before July 2020, but their board as of July, and remember, this is the same month that this webinar is broadcast, it's over 60 people, and it's global, and these are some major players in this space. These are people from Omidyar Network, from JP Morgan Chase, from the Mayo Clinic, people representing the United Nations Sustainable Development Goal implementation, Johns Hopkins, BlackRock, World Economic Forum. So these are very major players that all of a sudden, poof, 60 people show up for this Commons Project. And they have several products that they're pitching. One is called the Common Pass. So that is going to be your digital system of managing your travel or your mobility. So that's the airport verification that you're allowed to travel. And it's unclear at this point whether that's simply air travel or if that's crossing borders, or what nature of border that is. Is that crossing from one neighborhood to the other, or is that out of state? Like, what level of control are they going to enact? The other one is called Common Health, and Common Health, this was tied to Cornell Technion, which I had mentioned before in their small data lab. It's interoperable data systems. So that's exactly what we were talking about with the UBI, is like, oh, here, we'll just have all of your wearable technology that's telling us how you're behaving and if you're doing healthy behaviors, and it will all be stored here on your Common Health app. And then you can unlock that when you need to get some kind of health care or demonstrate that you're appropriately compliant with the healthcare protocols. The other one is called COVID Check. So that is something that schools and employers can use to decide if you're allowed in, right? So if you're allowed to access education or you're allowed to actually go to your job, the COVID check is that element. And then there's something called Common Geo, which is geographic-based analytics, data analytics. And all of this is sort of framed around COVID, but the Commons Project isn't just COVID specific. It's essentially sort of saying we're doing data analytics for the common good. But clearly the common good is what's good for JP Morgan Chase and the World Economic Forum and their lackeys at Johns Hopkins and the Mayo Clinic. It's not actually about what's good for regular folks. And so I am in the process of tracking these 60 board members, but it's important to know that several of the co-founders of this entity, like they're all in health data analytics, and again, that's UN Sustainable Development Goal number 3 is health. And 2 of the founders were connected with something called Wellcoin, Wellcoin. And this is essentially like a blockchain-based, a token economy-based system where you earn value based on health behaviors. And so in their pitch for this Wellcoin, in Philadelphia we had something, and I think it was actually very early token economy, called Recycle Bank, and you would have points. And there was a QR code that was on your recycle bin, and there was some scanning that if you recycled that week, you got a certain number of points and you could redeem them for a certain list of items that were available on this website. Most people, they didn't really care about the points because they were just recycling because they thought it was the right thing to do, not because they were interested in earning points. Well, Wellcoin is the same thing, but you're going to have to demonstrate healthy behaviors, that you ate properly, that you did enough physical exercise, that you did certain mental health treatments. And not just you, this product, it was connected to how you take care of your pets and how you take care of your children. So they're tracking all of this. And again, this is framed at this point as voluntary, right? These are the people who are behind Common Pass. Like, you can, if you're poor, if you exercise really hard all month, you can earn a pair of sneakers. That's the kind of mentality, that's what they're talking about in the system. And now with wearable technology, they can put nanotech in your clothes, in your shoes. They can put it in your food, right? Like you can consume your nanotechnology and be tracking and transmitting data potentially in this internet of bodies, and all of it accruing to your various common health data analytics passports. So I just want to say, like, these things are all connected. And I would say we really need to be paying attention to Rhode Island, because in 2018, Gina Raimondo actually held a health innovation forum with the tech sectors and Israel in Rhode Island. So they were specifically melding biotech analytics in Rhode Island in this crucible all together. And I'm just sort of looking over my notes to see if I've missed the main pieces. I think I've got, let me just speak a little bit, like I said, Rhode Island, I'm going to just touch on some of the things they talked about in this webinar, and I've set up keywords. I would encourage people, if they're curious, if you go to littlesis.org, it's crowdsourced mapping, and I haven't created the map yet, but if you just Google Israel and Rhode Island digital government during pandemic webinar, or Israel and Rhode Island, it'll come up. It'll show all of these various keywords, but they're talking about data analytics, STEM education, reskilling, open government, GovTech, tying these things to the real ID. Again, the blockchain program, they ultimately contracted with Infosys Design, which has a hub in Rhode Island, but I think they're actually based out of India, which is consistent. There are a lot of connections to India, even on Tata is connected with the Cornell Tech campus in New York City. And they specifically talked about open data and impact investing. One of the presenters in this, so it was, let me just go back. Who was, okay, so Shira Lev Ami, she was the last one that I've been looking at. Again, she was with Israeli Defense Forces in the Signals Intelligence Division, that unit, 8200 unit. She then left and created a data analytics company called Springia. That's an interesting one, Springia. That's AI, health data analytics. A lot of this is tied with electronic healthcare records and interoperable data tied to healthcare. If you remember, in the US, a lot of the EHR that came through the Affordable Care Act. So that was Obama, and he was working with Zeke Emanuel, who was sort of the architect of the Affordable Care Act, to get these electronic health records in place to set up the Human Capital Data Analytics Program. So she is currently working for JDC Israel, which is the Joint Distribution Committee Israel, with a number of ties to both the US and Canada. Part of that, there's something called the Elka Institute for Leadership. So they're sort of the change agents. They are training people in essentially impact investing, and their focus is on youth, the elderly, and financial literacy. And just in 2016, they actually did a whole white paper report about creating new impact metrics for these social impact investments. So again, there are direct connections between impact investing, health data analytics, Israel, and Rhode Island. And I think that's probably most of what I wanted to cover. Jason, can you think of, the digital rights, that's right. So again, I had mentioned that Israel is a digital nation. Throughout the webinar, there were huge conversations about how this was such a great opportunity to push everything online, and for parts of Israel that weren't already well underway with their digital government to sort of make that happen, and to push digital education, to push the shift to telemedicine, that it was this wonderful, great opportunity. Part of the Digital Israel program is tied in with this social, it's coming through the Ministry of Social Equality, again, impact investing, and they had something called the Rights Engine, which is essentially an app that would sort of link you up with what your benefits would be. And so I think that this will be sort of this digital rights, is that it will supersede the rights, your existing rights, but will be more like based on your social credit scoring, the rights that are available to you, the privileges that are available to you. And this is a bit of a reach at this point, speculation, but each person will have their own set of rights, things that they're entitled to, and it will be based on, I think, your digital dust and your behavior. Let's see. And then, so the one other person, so I spoke about the person connected there. The other is Shiley Spiegelman, and she is with the Ministry of Science and Technology for the State of Israel. So these were not like small players in on this webinar. Like, these were very high level officials, both in healthcare and in the tech sector. And she is a Changemaker affiliate with Social Impact Israel, and connected to impact investing through the tech. And she was the former deputy head of strategy for Bank Hapoalim, which is like Israel's largest bank. So it's banking and tech and human capital tracking. So I think that's most of what I'm talking about. I think it's important to realize too that Rhode Island and also Southern New Hampshire are sort of the playgrounds for Boston venture capital and like Boston tech, VC, and finance. And so they sort of leave like Massachusetts and sort of go experiment on their neighbors. And so Learn Launch is a VC accelerator in ed tech. They were doing work in Rhode Island, tied to the Learning Accelerator, which was advancing blended learning. And they actually, I think, set up a program with a private school in Rhode Island called Rocky Hill School, where they were going to sort of use the children as guinea pigs, not only of working on blended learning and ed tech and data analytics, but teaching like entrepreneurship. So the kids in the private school would be trained up to be like the data dashboard tyranny specialists, while they're being experimented on, but they would like learn how to be the managers of these data systems. Like the private school kids would get the training on how to be the managers of everyone else. And the poor kids in like Providence and the inner city areas would be like on the dashboards and doing their work-based learning, which isn't like some cool drumming gig like they're pitching, but is actually like some sort of sad, like soul-killing other kind of job, coding job, or coding the digital jail kind of job is what they're going to end up with. But yeah, so the Boston ties to both Rhode Island and Southern New Hampshire are important. I don't know, does anybody...
We do have a couple questions here. One is, does Allison know if the bill HR 6666, you know about that bill.
I'm trying to remember which one.
That was the it's 6666. It's or equivalent bill. It was a contract tracing bill.
Yeah.
And do you know of any other bills? Or do you know where that one's at, or if there are other bills being pushed through Congress? So that was the first question.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, I have other colleagues, my friend Lynn Taylor in North Carolina, she's much better at tracking all of the immediate bills. For me, I feel like both parties are involved in this, and this is actually coming through a global agenda. So while it's useful to know what the particular bills are, like I don't stay on top of it as much as like the immediate piece, because I'm trying to sort of track the bigger, the higher level connections, rather than, not that it's not valuable, that's valuable information, but I can't speak to that per se right now.
Another one was, do you think any of this is actually new, or is it a rollout of a hidden system that was set up post-war, or maybe even pre-war, only capable, I added that, only more capable by computing power, and now normalized into emergency management?
Yeah, no,
So hold on, I gotta jump back to you.
All right, oh, sorry. Yeah. Yeah, so I think that this is very much, these are parallel systems that we're running together with technological development and computing power, right? And so this, you know, I've mentioned before, like understanding the history of technocracy is important. I mean, predating that, sort of managing people as human capital, because I haven't specifically like laid this out, but this is, there's a definite racial component tied to chattel slavery and unfree labor that goes back at least 400 or 500 years to the transatlantic slave trade. So these systems, it's just reinventing, and I think in some ways there's an intensification and a speeding up. Many of these systems, like, so there's the technocracy that was late, you know, early 20th century into the 1930s that then like doubled down with Brzezinski in the 70s. Then it jumps to like the 90s with sort of the remakeover of the welfare state and early computing systems. And then those systems could jump again once you had cloud-based systems. So the cloud-based systems enabled, you know, the Internet of Things and computing, you know, ubiquitous computing. And now we've got potentially, you know, we've got the blockchain systems and these decentralized ledgers and the 5G technologies. I mean, I guess the question is will the systems hold? Like, will the satellites, will the 5G, will they be able to actually give everybody a digital identity without melting everything down? I don't know the answers to that. You know, I would say the cybernetics program has been in place easily since World War II and advancing very clearly. In 2001, there was a gathering called Embedded Everywhere about sensor network systems, and Deborah Estrin, who is a connected, I believe she's on the board of the Commons Project, and she's the key player at the Small Data Lab at Cornell Tech. She was the chair of this discussion in 2001, and they were already talking about smart buildings and ingestible technology, tracking technologies, and wearable technologies. This was 2001. So, I mean, that's the thing to me that is incredulous. And like when they're asking everybody to like trust science, it's like clearly there were scientists who almost 20 years ago knew that this was the program, and they were still willing to build this world. Like they were still willing to build it. And so, you know, I think as things like COVID is throwing this into strong relief of like, what is science? Is science, does it stand alone, or is it always pushing an agenda? And I think in many respects, what we're seeing now with science and technology and STEM is that it is advancing an anti-life agenda, an agenda that is more about mechanics and control and domination than anything else. So I guess long story short is, yes, I believe it's a continuation of a very long project, at least back to the slave trade, if not earlier. But yeah, darn it, don't code it. Do not code the panopticon. Like that's what I think we have to figure out.
One I missed from earlier, someone had asked if you thought Ethereum would end up being a dominant platform, a crypto platform.
Well, so I think all of this is going to run on smart contracts. So, and if you guys haven't had a chance, I have Joseph Gonzalez and I did a long webinar essentially talking about a gamified world, like a militarized gamified world of augmented reality. And all of that runs on smart contracting mechanisms. Like whether it's Ethereum, like I'm not that knowledgeable about the capacities of these programs. I think someone chimed in our webinar that they thought maybe it was being upgraded or there was a different platform that was more likely. But I would say this idea that you embed life as contract agreements, and when the terms of the contracts are fulfilled, things are unlocked or things happen. And that is the world that is being built now. Like, did you do all the things you were told when you left your house today on your pathway? If so, and you can prove it, and this is this is the other thing on Wellcoin that I missed, is that they were talking about how you would prove it. And they said, well, we prefer wearable technology because we don't want you to lie because we'll catch you. You can, if you're submit a verification, and we'll text a friend to verify that you did your run today. So that's one way. But we're also having a ton of people take photographs, and that's the verification. That somehow, like if you ate a salad at lunch, you photograph your salad. I don't know if you have to photograph it before you eat it and then with the bowl empty, but like that they would have these verification systems. But that's the kind of, these are all smart contracts. Did you eat your salad? Document it, right? If you ate your salad, then you're allowed to have your dessert. Document it, but you're not allowed to have seconds. Document it. Like
well, with smart toilets, they can just monitor it right there.
I forgot the smart toilet. Well, see, that's the other thing I was just telling Jason, like several years ago, and I'm kicking myself that I lost track of this talk. But it was a talk where they said, well, in the future of work, you're going to get paid to have a good night's sleep and to poop in a proper toilet. And they said that, and it didn't really register to me what they were talking about, like how that would actually work. But with this Wellcoin concept, I had posted something on my Facebook a week or so ago about that they have biometric identifiers of your anus, like your anal sphincter, like that there's a biometric component. So they would have toilets that would know if you sat on it. I don't know if they would then track like what the outcome of that transaction was. But that is like the technology that's out there, and you would think, why would they ever do such a crazy thing as to have biometrics to know who pooped in which toilet or how often? But the thing is, in this world of data insanity, they are probably going to install plumbing or like common toilets in poor countries, like countries that with people who don't have it, and they will finance that by saying there is some cost offset against some illness that would be caused by waterborne disease, right? Like open sewers. The cost of this disease is X amount. If we reduce that occurrence, we can justify installing the toilets, but we have to know who used the toilet, how often, and did they get health care later, and what that cost us or didn't cost us, and what the offset is, so that JP Morgan Chase can capture the impact market for that. And that's why they need biometric sphincter identification. It's going to be for these new crazy systems. And it's the sick logic of that, but we have to understand that's the world they're building. And when I say don't code it, I mean, the reality is that this world is going to be coded with unfree labor. Just as there's a really good book called Empire's Tracks by Manu Kuruka that I highly recommend, that talks about the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad and Chinese workers and indigenous resistance to the railroad and how they were built, and the connection of capital and the way in which corporations went out in advance of the state, and there was this partnership that also went with the military, and how these relationships all worked. And right now, 5G and the satellite networks and wearable technology are the new Transcontinental Railroad. That is what is being built. And it's not going to be built at full price. They're not going to pay people real wages to build it. It's going to be unfree labor. So it will be children, it will be refugees, it will be incarcerated or people under state supervision, it will be all sorts of people who will not be paid or adequately paid for the work they're doing. And then ultimately the work they're doing is to build a panopticon which will imprison us and allow us to be run by robots. And so how do we back that out? And I have to believe that most people who are now involved in the tech sector wouldn't want that future. Like even if I mean, probably there's some sicko folks that have enough money that they can have their own island, but that's going to get old eventually, I have to believe. Like, I mean, how happy can Richard Branson be on Necker Island indefinitely? Like, it's not that great of an island. Like, wouldn't you get sad eventually? I don't know, maybe not. But we don't want that world, because I think ultimately, too, all of the energy, it's just going to kill the planet, the minerals and the energy to run a virtual world on top of the real world.
I also was thinking too on the toilet thing is, you've read the articles about that they've been actually going into the sewage systems to trace COVID as well. I don't know if you saw that, but there's some articles going around about them like tracking COVID through the sewage system.
Well, I think that it's going to be a tyranny about informatics, right? Like they're going to, and I guess the question is, how do we even know, right? Like there's certain, like, I haven't read all of the papers, but talking about how it hasn't actually been isolated, right? Like that we just have to trust them, that they know what they're talking about, right? So they can pull anything out of their back pocket if they want to control global systems. And I spoke about this previously, but Goldman Sachs, has their fingers in several things around COVID. One is around masks, the use of masks in economic productivity. There's a return on investment about mask use, so that's an impact market, but again, making us wear masks. The other is connected with Google called an effective lockdown index. And that lockdown index wasn't limited. It wasn't a COVID-19 lockdown index. It wasn't even a coronavirus lockdown index. It was just an effective lockdown index. And so what I've said before is that, people in targeted communities know that there's no presumption of safety against empire in the United States. I think there are many other people who would cling to the idea that the government will protect us or protect our interests or has our best interests at heart. And I think that I would highly question that is the case. I think at this point, the government systems are meant to advantage empire and military interests and corporate interests over the people. And so if they can come up with some new illness and say it's in our feces, and then like, oh, everybody has to use the smart toilet so that we can track you, that's the kind of stuff that they're trying to normalize right now. They're trying to normalize this, and they're trying to turn our bodies into toxic systems, like a presumption of guilt that by living in a human body you're guilty, that you have a guilt of being human in a human body, and it's so dirty and terrible, as opposed to being like a magnificent and beautiful, being. And we shouldn't let them do that.
Yeah, I wanted to say one other thing and get your thoughts on it, which is I think that one of the difficulties that people have in really seeing what's happening is just their belief. There's like a foundational belief that people have that, yeah, there's corruption, there's bad apples, but they still kind of take the oligarchs at their word. They still kind of take the politicians. I mean, how bad does it have to get that people are still like, well, maybe Biden will come around. Like, we just need to nudge him a little bit to do the right thing. And like the idea that there are people that are very powerful in this world that don't think like you and I. They think of the world like a chessboard, and they're extremely unethical and capable of starting whole wars and killing millions of people without even like thinking twice about it. And I think that's hard for people that have a conscience and to think that actually exists. And that oh my gosh, that these people might actually conspire together with one another against. They don't just do everything out on the public. They're not having a public debate. That there's these decisions that were already made behind the scenes. And I think that people just have a hard time understanding that's actually the reality that we live in. And because you hear people just taking people at their word, taking the business corporations at their word, taking these. I mean, yeah, they know it's corrupt, but they just don't acknowledge just how corrupt it is. You know what I mean? So, and again, the big C word, conspiracy. I'm sorry, but that is just like that's a fact of how the world operates. That's a fact of how people in power operate. They conspire with one another.
I mean, the thing about conspiracy, I think that one of the elements is that it's hidden. And for the most part, it's not totally hidden. Like, you can go to the World Economic Forum COVID tracker, system and peel back, but you have to be willing to look at it. And I think that's the challenge that we are all facing, is that we're part of a structure, right? And we didn't choose to be born during this time. We didn't choose to be trying to navigate the world that we're trying to navigate, but we're at a time where power and wealth are so concentrated. And the people who have the power are still trying to find new ways of getting more and more and more. And what that means is that we are being turned into data and being essentially become prisoners of our own bodies to run these systems. And, they're probably, besides the billionaire class and like the next level down, like people at a managerial level that wouldn't, like, maybe they wouldn't want to do it, but they don't know the alternative. They're like, but I have to do my job, right? Like, this is the job. And so if they have to get up every day and do this job that is contributing in some small slice to this thing, but they don't have another choice, and individually they don't feel empowered to make the world different, then it's easy. It's just better to say, it's probably going to be okay. It's probably not going to happen. It's probably, and maybe in my lifetime it's not going to happen. Or my family will be okay because I'm going to do all the right things. And so I think it's a psychological block, because honestly, it's very hard to see this end game, to see an end game where they could say, you're not allowed to go off your block because you're geofenced, because your smart toilet indicated some anomaly. Wait 3 weeks and we'll get back to you. And like, there's not even a person to call because it's an avatar, it's an algorithm, right? Like, we're creating these automated systems. And I would highly recommend, there's a book, not a book, it's a short story called The Domestic Front. I think it was from the Oxford, it's like a literary magazine. And I'll have to look it up. Maybe, Jason, you can find it later. But The Domestic Front. But it's essentially, it's a short story about a person living in a smart house. And like, their partner has been swept away and they don't know why. They went off in an autonomous vehicle and they never came back. And this person is like fighting depression. And it opens with them asking the smart toaster to toast, like they toast, political figures defecating on them. Like, and they're like, oh, like they like photoshopping it, and you have to pay like to get the image in the toaster to the toast. And they're like, but my toaster really just wants to toast kittens. It doesn't want to be the toaster that has to toast the things I'm telling it to toast. But, and I'm living on my kitchen floor and I'm peeing in my sink because I know that my toilet is watching me. And, eventually he's trying to like figure out if he can like throw himself in his normal dryer and like, just bring an end to all of it, and it's dark. I mean, it's dark, but this was written maybe 3 years ago when I first started getting into this. I'm like, this is not that far off. And I'm not trying, but I'm just saying, like, we can choose otherwise. Like, we still have a window, but we need to open our eyes. This thing that happened, this webinar, which seems so totally run-of-the-mill, like Zoom webinar with Rhode Island and Israel. Like, what's the big deal, Allison? It's only 50 minutes on Zoom. But if you look at what they're saying, we're going to put you on blockchain. We're going to put your education online. We're going to put your healthcare online. These people are all tied to military signals intelligence and big data, corporate tracking and predictive analytics. And it's not going to be a good outcome if we don't intervene and say this isn't the world that we want.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I think, yeah. And it's complicated. The thing is, you have to be motivated to want to know. Most people aren't really motivated to know dark things. And it's not super easy. It's not an easily consumable item because it really is like a whole structure.
Yeah, I'm seeing like a horror movie, the tyrannical toilet. It'll flush your rights away.
No, it will tell you what your rights are available to you. Like when you use the toilet on a daily basis, it'll have your rights app. Based on your compliance, this is, we could tell, how many vegetables you ate. Maybe they'll have a smart, cat litter box, because you're also supposed to know how you take care of your pets too, right?
Yeah.
I know. You have to kind of laugh a little bit about it.
So, I think, I'm going to answer the next one. Someone asked if the blog was hacked recently. I will answer this question. I'm actually helping create a new look and some new functionality of the blog. And I uploaded this, they're called themes on WordPress. And the theme actually had a whole bunch of content that were built, sample content that was built into it. So it was sent out as if it were new posts. And so it just emailed everybody that there were new posts. That was my fault. If you guys need any wrinkle cream, Allison is not selling wrinkle cream at the moment. But, we never know. That might change. But that was my fault. So, but the website will be changing. And so if you see anything weird happen with the website, just relax. It's just going through.
Work in progress. So we're trying to make it better indexable and to sort of figure out how people want to use it. Because when I started this in 2016, I never thought I'd end up in this place that I am. So it's such a wide-ranging bunch of topics. And at this point, I have a lot of talks and slide shares and other elements that are not readily findable on the blog. So we're hoping to make it more easily navigated.
So you want to just take why don't I just say something and then I'll let you finish off. Okay. So thanks again for watching and listening to us, and we'll hopefully we might do some more of these. I'm leaving Philly, but I might do some of these via just Zoom or whatever. And I'm working on getting some other guests to do these with Allison as well. So anyways, thanks again for listening. And Allison, you want to take us out?
Yeah. Anyway, thank you. I'm sorry this was probably a little more scattered than my normal presentation, but I think I'm going to be working on writing this up. I want to write a piece up on the webinar specifically, so look for that in the near future, and also on the Commons Project. But I would encourage you to if you're interested in sort of seeing the scope of this, because I keep trying to convince my spouse that this is a serious business, and I'm like, look, 8,200 unit Israeli Defense Forces has alumni have their own impact fund, right? And they're working in Rhode Island. So this is real, and we need to pay attention. So those pieces are coming, and thanks for listening in. Hopefully you have some food for thought. And, I would just say, don't give up hope. We're still free to talk about this stuff so far. And, I think the more we talk about it and talk about concerns about it, the better it will be. And we're not crazy. This is actually really happening. And it's a sea change around humanity. And I think I posted on my Facebook last night, something, it got a number of shares, but when Joseph and I were doing our webinar, we had one individual who was sort of like, well, I'm good. I've got my land, and I've got my gold, and I've got my supplies, and I've got my things, and I'm good. It's a bit jarring, because I'm not saying don't be prepared and don't sort of make provisions and sort of get in the headspace of what's happening. But I would say, I really think we're approaching a point at which people have to know, are you fighting for your small world, like your nuclear family or yourself, and you're going to sort of expect to pull out of this, or are we fighting for all of humanity? And my take on this is that we actually are fighting for what it will be to live as free beings in the world. And the digital systems that are coming online, and this is something that, Corey and Clive Spash are more knowledgeable about, but they're also coming for the natural world too. They're coming for all systems of the earth, of which humanity in the UN Sustainable Development Goals were about 2/3 of those goals, the anti-poverty goals, but the rest are the waters and the plants and the animals, and even down to the microorganisms. And they really want to control it all. So if we want to fight to have a world of right relationships, now's the time to start building common cause, not the Commons Project kind, but the real kind with one another, and to seek that common cause, to understand that what's coming is coming out of a long history of technological development, but also systematic oppression of Black people, of brown people, of chattel slavery, of unfree labor, and now it's broadening for all of us. So we really do need to build that common cause and to not be fragmented among lots of different sort of identity systems, like come from a good place and come from a hard place. And I think I'm so hopeful. I love you guys. So good night.
I will say one last quick thing. Somebody said I can't wait to see more. I've done a ton of interviews with Allison. I've got like hours and hours and hours and hours. And they're on the YouTube. So if you go to youtube.com/C, which is channel, /ArgusFest, which is ARGUSFEST, like short for festival. I would have created a title, but I just thought of this. But there's a whole bunch of her talks. If you just search Allison Haver McDowell on YouTube, there's a bunch of stuff. But please get her. The thing is, like, this needs to be common knowledge. The stuff, people that get blown away, they're like, it's a little overwhelming because it's not part of the regular vernacular, like even the language that she's using. It's language that's used by people at the World Economic Forum, but the average person doesn't talk like that. But we need to get people to understand these things and to listen to Allison and others who are doing work making these connections. And so if you can, just share her work and talk to people. I'm constantly talking to people and actually bugging people like, hey, you really need to listen to this person and some of the research that she's pulled together over the past 5 years. So please share the work, and thanks again, and have a lovely evening.